Welcome to ToK Today. I'm Daniel and I have 5 fast and fruitful thoughts for ToK Essay number 4, November 25. Now that's the essay which is asking, however the methods change, does the scope remain the same? Now fast and fruitful thought number 1 is, like many ToK essays, it's all about defining terms. Now, defining the methods is fairly straightforward. You can just take the methods from the methods section of the knowledge framework. We can critically examine this later on, but it's not a big issue at this point. Something remaining the same is a slightly bigger issue. For us to agree that something has remained the same or changed, we have to agree on its state to begin with. I mean, if we're going to argue that the invention of photography changed the scope of art between the 19th and 20th century, we're going to have to agree on what the scope of art was like before the invention of photography. So we need to think about what constitutes a change, and ergo, what constitutes remains the same. Which then takes us on to the big issue with this essay. And that's defining the scope. What constitutes the scope? How do you decide what the scope is made up of? Now you could take the definition from the IB-ToK study guide. There it is on the screen. Now you might say that's a little vague and has a significant crossover with the perspectives section of the knowledge framework. So maybe you want to come up with a more specific, operationalised definition of the scope, the way that you use the scope in your ToK lessons every week. I mean, suffice to say, spend some time carefully defining the scope, and maybe that definition will change as your essay progresses. Fast but fruitful thought number 2 is about the line. The described title states that however methods change, the scope remains the same. The word however suggests that they want us to consider varying degrees of change in the method. For example, the change from oil painting to acrylics may be a small change, but the change from oil painting to using coordinated swarms of drones in the night sky to depict images is a big change. So you may wish to ask yourself, well, where's the line? Where's the line from which a change in methods does change the scope? It could be that a change in methods changes who is producing knowledge, or for whom the knowledge is produced, or it changes the purpose of the knowledge produced, or maybe even the meaning of the knowledge produced. It's all open for your wonderful ToK discussion and debate. However, it's clear that it all comes back to how you define the scope. And if you want more help understanding the various ways in which you can define the scope, then be sure to pick up the ToK Today student guidance notes for essay number 4 from the ToK Today shop, linked in the video description or using the QR codes on the screen. Now the notes are highly detailed, over 7,500 words, and they contain knowledge claims, knowledge arguments, suggestions for real-life examples, and evaluation points that you can adapt for use in your essay. And in the May 2024 session, 72% of students using the ToK Today student guidance notes were awarded a grade A in ToK. Fast but fruitful thought number 3 is choose your AOKs carefully. This essay gives you a free choice of AOKs, and maybe any knowledge argument can be developed for any AOK. But some knowledge arguments are easier to develop for some AOKs than others. For example, if you're arguing that changes in method do not change the scope because the knower defines the scope, it will probably be easier to make that argument in AOK the arts or AOK history than it is in AOK the human or natural sciences, which is not to say that you can't make it in AOK human or natural sciences. It's just a harder argument to make. So maybe you should write your knowledge arguments in tandem with your AOKs, or maybe even before you choose your AOKs. Ooh, radical. And just a couple of words to the wise. Choosing AOK human sciences and AOK natural sciences limits the range of knowledge arguments that you can develop because they largely use the same methods. Of course, you could have some very sophisticated arguments about the differences in the scopes of these two areas of knowledge, but if not, then it's easier to compare two AOKs that are more contrasty, and yes, that's a technical term. Secondly, please don't write about psychology if you don't study psychology. You're just making your life much harder by doing this, and I want to make your life much easier. Therefore, I recommend that you write about subjects that you actually study. Fast but fruitful thought number 4 is to think about the 4 pillars of knowledge in ToK. That's the acquisition of knowledge, the production or construction of knowledge, the evolution of knowledge, and the evaluation of knowledge. So to get my students thinking about this prescribed title, I ask them to adapt the pillars of knowledge to the prescribed title, or adapt the prescribed title to the pillars of knowledge. So the first pillar, we could adapt that to, if the methods change, how does the acquisition of the scope change? The second pillar is about the production of knowledge, and the actual essay itself is about the production of knowledge, so let's ignore that. The third pillar is about the evolution of knowledge, so we can adapt the question to, if the methods change, how does the evolution of the scope change? And the fourth pillar is about the evaluation of knowledge, so we can ask the question, if the methods change, does the scope become stronger or weaker? Now, the answers to these sort of sub-pillar questions don't answer the whole question, but they're ways into unpacking a more specific understanding of the relationship between the method and the scope. When I ask myself these questions, I often end up replying, well, it depends. It depends upon the AoK, it depends upon the discipline within the AoK, it depends upon the specific knowledge under examination, it depends upon the functions for which that knowledge is being used. Let's take 2 examples, street dance and ballet. If the methods of the production of knowledge of street dancers are changed by street dancers, then yes, the scope of street dance probably does change. However, if the methods of production of the knowledge of ballet are changed by people outside of the institutional gatekeepers of ballet, then no, the scope of ballet probably does not change. It depends. It depends on who is changing the methods, why they're changing the methods, and most of all, what are we defining as the scope of street dance and the scope of ballet? Anyone ever watch Dirty Dancing or Billy Elliot? Right, let's move on. Our final fast and fruitful thought on essay number 4 is about functionality. Is the scope a static entity, or is the scope a functional entity? For example, the scope of physics today could be said to be different to the scope of physics in the 16th century. However, the contemporary scope of some other discipline, or AoK, might be very similar to the scope back in the 16th century. Maybe physics has adapted to function in a changing world, whereas the scope of some other AoK or discipline has remained fixed, despite the world around it changing. Now, you see how I can't name that fixed or static discipline or AoK? That's because I think that the scope of every discipline and every area of knowledge is essentially a functional entity that has a dynamic, mutually inclusive relationship to the changing world around it. As such, I don't think it's methods that change the scope. I think that they change each other. But that's just me, and you don't have to argue that. You can argue something else. And if you want more support deciding what you want to argue, then we have 3 main ways of helping you. Online ToK coaching can help you to develop your essay whilst retaining academic integrity. Written feedback on your ToK essay draft gives you detailed suggestions on areas for development. And the ever-popular ToK Today student guidance notes give you examples of knowledge claims, knowledge arguments, evaluation points, and real-world examples that you could adapt for use in your essay. All of these services and more are available in the ToK Today shop, linked in the video description. I hope that you found these 5 fast and fruitful thoughts useful. If you did, then you could change my scope by hitting like and subscribe. Remember what Heraclitus taught us. The only constant in life is change. Best wishes for your ToK essay writing, and stay ToKtastic, my friend.